Joining me now, we have Democratic strategist and former advisor to the Obama campaign, Amisha Cross, and Brendan Buck, MSNBC political analyst and previously served as press secretary to former VP candidate Paul Ryan. Welcome, guys. All right, Brendan, you first, because during this interview, Biden was repeatedly asked if he was being honest about his chances of beating Trump and was asked this question about the stakes. Take a listen.
And if you stay in and Trump is elected and everything you're warning about comes to pass, how will you feel in January?
I feel as long as I gave it my all and I did the goodest job as I know I can do. That's what this is about.
What was your reaction to that, Brendan?
Yeah, I think that's one of the moments that I think has got Democrats most upset, because that's not what this is about. A lot of people are working really hard to prevent Donald Trump from being president for a lot more substantive reasons. And I think one of the things that's a fundamental problem here is that the president thinks all of this is about him, and he's not understanding both the stakes for the House and the Senate, obviously the White House. But he seems to have bought into what I think is a bit of a myth about his legacy here. He talks about how in 2020 he came back and defied the odds to become president. That is certainly true. But he's also trying to cite the 2020 midterms. Look, the 2020 midterms, Democrats did well because Roe versus Wade got struck down. It had nothing to do with Joe Biden. He seems so bought into this idea that he is this unstoppable force. And maybe it's just people are telling him these things and trying to tell him what he wants to hear. But I think he needs to recognize that there are a lot higher stakes than just trying hard.
So I'm curious your takeaway to the interview last night, but also, does Biden not believe, Amisha, does he not believe that his campaign is at a perilous moment, or might he be trying to show confidence, or is it possible he's not being honestly told the alarm that exists among Democrats after his debate?
I don't think anyone understands the alarm to our nation of a reelection of former President Trump more than current President Joe Biden. But in addition to that, I think that this is a president who was showcasing strength last night. This is a president who fully understands that that debate did not go well. I don't think that he's disillusioned by that at all. But he also recognizes that there has to be a path forward. With as much as media wants to stay mired in something that happened days ago at this point, he recognizes that the trudge to November did not just start, and it definitely did not end with that debate. He also recognizes that he's been counted out by media, he's been counted out by polls, he's been counted out by prognosticators time after time after time, and each time he has come back and he has excelled. This is a president who knows what's at stake. This is a president who understands not only the importance of his legacy, but more importantly, the importance of fighting for and maintaining this democracy, which is literally at stake should Trump get reelected. He knows what Project 2025 is, but moreover, he knows that former President Trump wants to eradicate our basic civil rights, and he is in a high fire trudge to do so. So I definitely think that President Biden is alert, he's aware, and he's being active in recognizing that that debate was one night. It does not eradicate his work as president. It does not eradicate his work as the vice president under former President Obama, and it does not eradicate the importance of keeping America on a track forward.
So after the debate, Brendan, many had hoped that his performance was something of a one-off, that he was either overprepared, really had a cold, whatever it was. But there is some new reporting that suggests lawmakers noticed some memory lapses, the slurring of words that we all can hear, vacant look at times, and they've noticed it for a period of time now. Did last night's interview fight off or reinforce those views? I mean, it wasn't a bad interview. It didn't do a lot of damage by most accounts.
It wasn't a bad interview, but I think it also showed him completely out of touch with the reality. There was very painful back and forth between the president and George Stephanopoulos about the polling reality that he faces. And it was unclear whether he just simply doesn't believe a lot of the polls that are out there, or if he's being shown data that is just in conflict with what everybody else is seeing. George Stephanopoulos made the point, I've never seen a president get reelected with 36%.
Yeah, 36%
approval.
Right.
And he sort of just denied that that's what's going on. So when you have a person who is being accused of struggling with their cognitive ability to then show that you're a bit out of touch with reality, I don't think that helps anybody. So no, this isn't gonna make it all better. And I think Julie's right. When members come back tomorrow, or I guess on Monday, it's going to be an absolute feeding frenzy. You can't. I think it's really important to appreciate. They are pretty far out there on the limb, saying that their own president is struggling with his ability to process things. you can't go back from that. At this point, it would be really hard if he just sticks around. I think they are going to realize this week they need to push much harder to get him out, or they're all going to be on the record themselves questioning their own nominee going against Donald Trump.
But then there's the who does this, Amisha, because Bill Kristol noted for the Bulwark that Nancy Pelosi stepped down from her role as Speaker at 82, same age Biden's going to be when his first term ends. He said that Pelosi could play a pivotal role in helping Biden decide whether or not to step aside. Who do you think could have the biggest impact on this decision? Or do you believe that he is staying in, as he said quite definitively during the interview last night?
I think that Joe Biden has made it very clear that he is in this to win it and he is in it to stay, and that any questions to the contrary are being driven by polls again, some of which who have been who have not shown Biden in the best light since 2020. So I think that there is something to be said about his frustration with the polling, because the polling has been consistently wrong on many things. What we do know is factual is that this race is going to be tight. It was tight before that debate. It's going to be tight after this debate. He fully recognizes that. But the person who has made the decision, the only person who can make the decision, is Joe Biden. And Joe Biden has said he is in this thing to fight it. And anyone who does not want to see a Donald Trump re-election has to also abide by and vote for the Biden-Harris ticket. That is the ticket for the Democratic Party, period.
What about the money, Brendan? Because top Democratic donors, and that includes notably the Disney heir, one of them, Abigail Disney, who say they're not going to give money to the party until Biden drops out. Does this reinforce the need for the party to make a decision, make it either way, either having Biden step aside or putting in the work to win over these donors? I mean, would donors sit out the race knowing that that may help hand the White House to Trump?
Yeah, it feels like a bit of an empty threat, but if it's not, that is a huge deal. Obviously, the president is already losing. He just had a bad debate performance that made his situation worse off. And if now you're going to take money off the table, that's a huge problem. But to my point, you need to push this relatively quickly. This can't drag on much longer. He needs to put this. I think he's trying to put this to rest, but at the same time, it also feels like he's sort of stringing us along. You know, they wanted to do this interview, and now they're saying, well, there's going to be a press conference next Thursday. Keep an eye on that press conference. And it feels like he's just trying to drag this out, buy some more time. But I don't know that that's really getting the job done. I think this is going to be a very explosive week. I think it's all going to come to an head. And if they aren't able to push him out, I would expect pretty quickly a lot of those Democrats are going to start shutting their mouth and just getting on the team, because this can't be the conversation for much longer if they expect to turn it around.
To that end, Amisha, first of all, what's your take on donors and the time frame? I mean, how much longer can this conversation, these questions, continue without doing permanent damage?
It depends on how long media wants to engage in the conversation. I think that for President Biden, we know what his schedule is about to look like. He's going to be in the battleground states fiercely. He's also utilizing his surrogates in the battleground states. We recognize that those are the states that are weighted and count the most in this election cycle. He is going to be frontal. His campaign has made that very clear. And I think that he understands, again, that turnout is going to be everything. This race was never one that was in the bag. It was always going to be extremely tight. He's got to go, old school, guerrilla style when it comes to getting your voters out in GOTV. He fully understands this concept. And what we're going to see in the next few months, and what we're going to see, honestly, next week as well, is him out here pressing the flesh, him having those events, him meeting with the people that matter on the ground, and making sure that those donors understand that he's not going anywhere. In the same way that those Republican donors were somewhat shy to give money to Trump because they thought somebody else was going to magically appear to become the head of the Republican Party, that did not happen. And what we saw was those donors coalesce around Trump when everyone else fell off. We are not going to see a Joseph Robinette Biden drop out of this race. So donors are going to get on board. They're going to stay on board. And I don't assume that that's going to change, because this president has already made it painstakingly clear that this is the ticket. And Kamala Harris, his vice president, is actually in New Orleans now having this conversation with Black voters, the largest recipients of the largest portion of people who are at the Essence Festival. They are making it very clear that these two run in tandem. It is the Biden-Harris ticket. There is no other way. The logistics of that would be wild. And Democrats are going to be on board with this as well.
Okay. Amisha Cross and Brendan Buck, we will see. Thank you so much. Always enjoy our chats.
Hey there, MSNBC fans. I'm Luke Russert, and be sure to join me, Rachel Maddow, Jen Psaki, Lawrence O'Donnell, Steve Kornacki, Joy Reid, and many more September 7th in Brooklyn, MSNBC Live Democracy 2024. Click on the link for ticket information. We will see you there.